This off.
Thanks, Jen. Two quick subjects. President Biden said last Thursday that Israel had a right to defend itself and that its actions thus far were not a significant overreaction. After the events of the past few days, does the president still believe that Israel's actions have been proportionate?
Well, first, Josh, let me remind people that the president also did 2 calls over the weekend that we did readouts of. And in those calls, he stressed the need for Hamas to cease firing rockets into Israel and affirmed, again, Israel's right to defend itself against terrorist attacks. As I would note from the reports, there have been more than 3,000 rockets that have been shot from Hamas into Israel over the last several days. He also expressed his concern that this current period of conflict has tragically claimed the lives of Israeli and Palestinian civilians, including children, and he raised concerns about the safety of journalists, including those who had to leave the building where the Associated Press was based, and reinforced the need to ensure their protection. So how we are looking at this from our standpoint is that our focus, our goal, every single action we take, every statement we make is with the objective of reducing the violence and bringing an end to the conflict on the ground. There are times in diplomacy where we'll need to keep those conversations quieter, where we won't read out every component of it. But that is our objective, and that is the prism through which every action and every comment is being made.
Gotcha. And then,
go ahead.
Secondly,
Go ahead, Josh.
Just stepping back a little bit from the current situation with Israel and the Palestinian territories, we reported over the weekend that your envoy in the region has been basically telling both sides that they need to start thinking about what a peace process might look like after this happens. And I'm just curious whether the president is willing to invest himself in being a broker in that kind of a process, and whether you're starting to think about what that might look like.
Well, Trevor, I think it's clear to everyone who's been a part of and covered or been a part of, I was at the State Department back in 2014. We all know that the only way to bring an end to violence, to bring an end to this escalation of violence, is for there to be a two-state solution over time. And in both calls the president made this weekend, he underscored his strong commitment to a negotiated two-state solution as the best path to reach a just and lasting resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But in terms of what that would take, or what form and what it would look like, it is going to require both parties wanting to engage in that and wanting to have a discussion about the path forward. And who would be the point person from this end? We're certainly not quite there yet. It will be up to both parties to decide if they want to move forward on that pathway.
Okay, and then just one more question on that subject, which is what would be the value in making a case for a ceasefire from your standpoint, and would you do that?
Well, let me first say that what's most important is that we all share. The United States shares with a range of countries around the world, those who have been outspoken at the UN, our partners and friends in Europe, a commitment and a desire to bring an end to the violence. And how we are approaching this is through the prism, again, of what steps can we take, what actions can we take behind the scenes. We've had over 60 calls in the past week from the president on down with senior leaders in Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and across the region. And how can we bring an end to the violence through our relationships in the region, both with the Israelis and the Israeli government, and also with key other partners, whether it's the Egyptians, the Qataris, and other key countries in the region. So that is how we are approaching it from the United States. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. I want to ask that in the inverse. Why not? What is the value in not calling for a ceasefire right now, given many of those countries that you just listed, our close allies, France, UK, Egypt, Jordan, have done so, are doing so?
That is true, but the role we are playing, the action, the prism we are making all of our decisions through is how can we help bring an end to the violence and bring an end to de-escalate the situation on the ground. And our calculation at this point is that having those conversations behind the scenes, weighing in with our important strategic partnership we have with Israel, also with other countries in the region, is the most constructive approach we can take. So our approach is through quiet, intensive diplomacy, and that's where we feel we can be most effective.
And does the president's assessment from last Thursday still stand that he does not see Israel strikes as a significant overreaction?
Again, I think I noted that the president also had 2 calls over the weekend since Thursday where he conveyed his concerns about the current period of conflict, the lives of Israeli and Palestinian civilians that have been lost, and certainly raised his concern about the safety and security of journalists and others who have been impacted on the ground. So we're not going to give a day-by-day evaluation. I will say that our objective is to, just like it is with other countries and our partners around the world, is to play the role we can play in the most constructive way possible to reduce the violence, to de-escalate the situation on the ground, and a great deal of that is going to be through intensive, quiet diplomacy behind the scenes.
One last question, if I may. You mentioned the journalists on the ground on that Gaza tower strike. The Prime Minister Netanyahu called this a perfectly legitimate target. Does this White House agree with that?
Well, I would say that any intelligence is being handled through intelligence channels. I don't have a further readout or confirmation of any of those details from here, nor do I have an assessment of that intelligence that was stated by the Prime Minister. Go ahead.
Hey, Jen. The president obviously has a decades-long relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu. They met a number of times, of course, most recently when he was the vice president. Tom Friedman wrote today about this being a January 6th moment for Prime Minister Netanyahu. Is there a concern at the White House by the president that domestic politics in Israel are currently a barrier to an end to this escalation of violence?
Well, I will say, Mike, good to see you, first of all. I will say that it's not our role to assess or analyze the politics on the ground in Israel. Everybody has their own politics in different regions of the world, and we see that play out in foreign policy all the time. What our role is to play be as constructive as possible in de-escalating the violence, bringing an end to the conflict. And there certainly is. The president has known the prime minister for some time. They've obviously spoken, hence we did the readout this weekend, and I'm sure they will speak again. We are also deeply engaged at the highest levels. Our national security advisor spoke with his counterpart earlier this morning. We've done, again, more than 60 calls over the past week with a range of partners in the region. So our objective here, our role, is not to do political analysis or provide motivation for any actions, but to take steps we can take as a leader in the world, as a country with deep relationships in the region to de-escalate the violence on the ground.
Speaking of domestic politics, you have a letter from a majority of the Senate Democrats calling for the White House to demand a ceasefire. You also have Democrats in the party, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, calling Israel an apartheid state. Senator Bernie Sanders is saying that potentially this should lead the U.S. to reevaluate foreign assistance. What's the White House's message to those in the president's party on this?
I will say our message is sometimes you have to step back from politics for a moment. It's not easy to do. And we recognize and agree that watching the lives lost of these Palestinian children, of these families, the fear you see in the eyes of the Israeli people, it is heartbreaking. We want to bring an end to the violence. We want to de-escalate the situation on the ground. The role we feel we can do that through, the most effective way we feel we can do that is through quiet and intensive diplomacy. And that is what our focus is on at this point in time. But we share an objective of de-escalating the circumstances on the ground. We share a view that a two-state solution is the only way to bring a lasting end to the violence.
And then just on another matter.
That was sent by Senate Democrats today calling for a ceasefire.
Has he seen it? I'm not sure if he's physically seen the letter. I know that he is, of course, aware of the calls and the points of view of a range of members of Congress on the conflict in Israel.
And has he spoken with any members of Congress about the situation?
I don't have any calls to read out.
When members of his own party share the belief that he is giving too much credence to Israel in this situation, are they wrong? The situation on the ground?
Look, I don't think it would be constructive to put any labels on it, as you've just outlined. The president's view and the view of senior leaders in the White House is that our role as the White House, as the federal government, as the President of the United States, is to play a constructive role in diplomacy, to use our role, our relationships around the world, to have intensive, quiet discussions with leaders in the region that we have long-standing relationships with. We share an objective of de-escalating the situation on the ground, of bringing an end to the conflict. That's an objective we share with members of Congress who have different points of view and are, of course, we support their ability to have different points of view, but we are approaching it through the prism of how we feel we can come to a most effective outcome.
Over the weekend, there were these reports that the Israelis had shared intelligence with the United States regarding what was going on in that tower that was blown up that housed the Associated Press and others. They said it was shared with the United States. Secretary of State this morning overseas said he didn't see it. He's not the intelligence director, so perhaps that's why. Has the president seen it, and can you confirm that the Israelis actually shared that intelligence with the United States?
Well, this would be handled, as you alluded to, through intelligence channels, and I'm not going to be in a position now or ever of committing or confirming who has or hasn't seen intelligence. What I believe the State Department has confirmed is that the Secretary was saying he has not personally seen the intelligence because such matters would be appropriately be handled through intelligence channels. So that's not necessarily a surprise, but in terms of who has or hasn't seen it, what's been communicated, I'm just not going to be in a position to confirm that.
And let me ask you one on COVID real quick.
I want to ask about Israel, but the 20 million doses are AstraZeneca doses, or there are
Other doses of approved vaccines.
Other vaccines.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly,
Okay.
yes.
So my question is, if you say that the only solution is a two-state solution, that requires both parties to want that, which they don't seem to right now, does that mean that despite all of your quiet, intensive diplomacy behind the scenes, that the U.S. really has limited leverage and power to solve this problem?
Well, I would say first that right now our quiet, intensive diplomacy is, of course, not negotiating a two-state solution.
Right.
I know you're not suggesting that, but just for clarity purposes, that is to bring an end and to de-escalate the violence on the ground now. And certainly we feel we have strong relationships with Israeli leaders, we have strong relationships with key partners in the region, and we're hopeful that those conversations, that quiet diplomacy, will help bring an end to the violence and reduce the conflict on the ground. As it relates to a two-state solution, you've been through many of these, as have I, and it is clear that it will require both parties to be committed themselves. The United States cannot manufacture on our own a two-state solution. It would require both parties having that desire to move
So
forward.
it sounds like what you want the American people to understand is that although you are trying your hardest and doing everything you can with all your relationships behind the scenes, the U.S. does not have the power to solve this problem, or it doesn't have the leverage to solve this problem.
Well, I would say first that it's been 7 days. Every single life that is lost, a Palestinian life, an Israeli life, is a tragedy. It has been 7 days. As you know, these conflicts have been far longer than that. That is not our objective, of course. We want to de-escalate as quickly as possible. But yes, it would require actions from Israel. It would require actions from Hamas to end the violence on the ground. There are a range of parties and entities who are involved in those discussions, and we want to play as constructive a role as humanly possible.
I just have one more quick one. Is it fair to say that you don't want to answer the question, yes or no, whether the president feels the Israeli response has been disproportionate?
I don't think it's constructive. We are going to take everything we convey, whether it's a statement or an action, is going to be to the end of de-escalating the situation on the ground. Hence, we're not going to give a day-by-day grade. Clearly, we want to end the violence. Clearly, we want to de-escalate. Clearly, we want the lives of Palestinians, Israelis to be saved. Go ahead, Nancy.
The Washington Post reported that the Biden administration earlier this month approved $735 million in weapon sales to Israel. Is the White House considering putting that on hold during the fighting? And is the Israeli response forcing the administration to reconsider future arms sales?
I've seen the report. I would say the State Department would be the entity to confirm, which I don't believe they have, any future sales or weapon sales. We do have an ongoing and abiding strategic security relationship and partnership with Israel, but in terms of the status of that or considerations moving forward, I'd point you to the State Department.
And just one more question.
Yamish?
Thanks so much for taking my question. Does President Biden think that there are any war crimes being committed right now in the Middle East? There are some experts who have told the New York Times that they think that there could have been war crimes on both sides.
We're not going to be making an assessment of that from here. Our objective is on taking every step we can to reduce the violence, to de-escalate the situation on the ground, to save lives, to ensure that we are bringing some stability back on the ground.
I mean, just to follow up, is the White House at all, I guess maybe, or is the president at all concerned just about the number of civilians that are being killed? That's why some of these experts are telling the New York Times that these are war crimes.
Well, I would say, Mish, that in the readouts that we put out this weekend, we included, and as I've noted a little bit earlier in the briefing, his concern about the lives lost. Every life lost is a tragedy, and certainly that's why we are eager to de-escalate the violence on the ground, bring an end to the conflict, so that more lives can be saved.
Can I ask you, I want to also switch to COVID.